The crowded bus. Lila stood at the bus stop, feeling the weight of her pregnancy pressing down on her both physically and emotionally. At 8 months along, she was used to the stares and whispers of strangers, but today felt different. The city buzzed around her with its usual chaos, horns honking, people rushing by, and the distant sound of construction echoing in the air. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself amidst the noise. As she waited for the bus, Lila's thoughts drifted to her day ahead. Working as a social worker at a local community center, she was passionate about helping families in need. The job was fulfilling but exhausting, especially now that she was so close to giving birth. She had spent the morning preparing for an important meeting with potential donors who could help fund their programs. The thought of presenting while feeling this heavy made her anxious. When the bus finally arrived with a hiss of brakes, Lila felt a surge of hope that perhaps today would be different. Maybe she would find an empty seat where she could rest her weary body during the ride home. As people began to board, she carefully stepped onto the bus, cradling her belly with one hand while holding onto the metal pole with the other. The interior was cramped and filled with chatter as passengers jostled for space. Lila scanned the rows of seats but found them all occupied, some by tired commuters engrossed in their phones and others by students laughing and joking among themselves. She took a deep breath and moved further down the aisle, hoping for an open spot. As she approached the middle of the bus, she noticed a man in an expensive suit sitting comfortably with his briefcase beside him. His name was Victor, an executive known for his sharp demeanor and quick temper. He glanced up as Lila approached but quickly looked away as if he hadn't seen her at all. "Excuse me," Lila said softly, hoping to catch his attention. "Could I please have your seat? I'm quite tired." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly as he regarded her with disdain. "I don't think so," he replied curtly without making eye contact. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks as embarrassment washed over her. She hesitated for a moment before moving on, feeling defeated by his dismissive attitude. The tension in the air thickened as nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, witnessing this exchange unfold. "Wow," whispered a young woman seated nearby to her friend. "That guy is such a jerk." Lila continued down the aisle, feeling small amidst the crowd that seemed indifferent to her plight. She could sense judgment from some passengers who were likely unaware of what it meant to carry life within them while navigating public transportation. As she reached the back of the bus, she finally spotted an empty seat next to an elderly man engrossed in reading his newspaper. Relief washed over her as she sat down heavily beside him and let out a sigh. "Thank you," she said quietly to him as he glanced up briefly before returning to his reading. The bus lurched forward, jolting everyone slightly as it pulled away from the stop. Lila settled into her seat and closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to block out everything around her, the noise, the stares, and especially Victor's coldness. But just as she began to relax, she heard raised voices coming from somewhere near the front of the bus. Curiosity piqued, Lila opened her eyes and turned slightly in her seat to see what was happening. Victor had stood up now, clearly agitated as he confronted another passenger, a young man who had accidentally bumped into him while trying to navigate through the narrow aisle. "Watch where you're going," Victor snapped loudly enough for everyone to hear. The young man stammered an apology but looked taken aback by Victor's aggression. The atmosphere shifted once again, passengers exchanged glances filled with discomfort as they witnessed this display of hostility. Lila felt anger bubbling inside her at Victor's behavior but also empathy for him. Perhaps he was having a rough day? Still, it didn't excuse how he treated others, especially someone who had done nothing wrong. "Some people just don't understand how hard life can be," murmured the elderly man beside her without looking up from his paper. Lila nodded silently in agreement but couldn't shake off how disheartening it was to see someone so consumed by negativity when there were so many beautiful moments waiting to be acknowledged instead. As they continued on their journey through city streets filled with honking horns and bustling pedestrians outside their windows, Lila reflected on how interconnected their lives were, even if they didn't realize it yet. The bus came to another stop, more passengers boarded while others disembarked, each carrying their own stories and struggles hidden beneath their exteriors like layers of paint on an old canvas waiting for someone brave enough to uncover its true beauty underneath. But today wasn't about revealing hidden truths, it was about survival amidst chaos, and all Lila wanted was some kindness from those around her during this challenging time in her life. Little did she know that this ordinary commute would soon become anything but ordinary, a moment that would ripple through their lives like stones dropped into still waters, creating waves far beyond what anyone could foresee. A moment of kindness. As the bus continued its journey, Lila felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. The discomfort of the crowded space was palpable, but she was determined to find a seat. Each step she took down the aisle felt heavier, her body protesting against the weight of her pregnancy. She glanced at the faces around her, some indifferent, others curious, but all absorbed in their own worlds. Just as she was about to lose hope, she spotted an empty seat near the back. A wave of relief washed over her as she made her way toward it. However, as she approached, she noticed that the seat was occupied by a large backpack, carelessly tossed aside by a young man engrossed in his phone. "Excuse me," Lila said gently, hoping to catch his attention. "Could you please move your bag? I need to sit down." The young man barely looked up, muttering something incoherent before returning to his screen. Frustration bubbled within her again, but she took a deep breath and forced herself to remain calm. Just as she was about to turn away, an elderly woman seated across the aisle spoke up. "Dear, you can sit here," Agnes said with a warm smile, patting the seat next to her. "I don't mind sharing." Lila's heart swelled with gratitude as she made her way over to Agnes. "Thank you so much," she replied, sinking into the seat and letting out a sigh of relief. Agnes was a sprightly woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and kind blue eyes that sparkled with wisdom. She wore a floral dress that seemed to radiate warmth and comfort, a stark contrast to the coldness Lila had just experienced moments before. "Pregnancy can be quite a challenge, can't it?" Agnes remarked knowingly as Lila settled in beside her. "I remember those days well." Lila smiled at the elderly woman's kindness. "It really is," she admitted. "I'm just trying to make it through each day." Agnes nodded sympathetically. "You're doing wonderfully. It takes strength to carry a child while managing everything else life throws at you." As they spoke, Lila felt an immediate connection with Agnes. The bus continued its route, jolting occasionally as it navigated through potholes and traffic lights. They exchanged stories about their lives. Lila shared her experiences working at the community center while Agnes recounted tales from her own youth and how times had changed. "I used to be a teacher," Agnes said with nostalgia in her voice. "I loved every moment of it. Watching my students grow and learn was such a joy." Lila could see the passion in Agnes's eyes as she spoke about her former career. "That sounds amazing," Lila replied genuinely. "I work with kids too, it's incredibly rewarding." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, creating a cocoon of comfort amidst the chaos of the bus ride. Lila felt lighter as they talked about their hopes and dreams for the future. Agnes spoke of wanting to see more of her grandchildren while Lila shared her aspirations for balancing motherhood and career. Suddenly, the bus lurched to a stop, causing Lila to grip the armrest tightly for support. A few passengers stumbled forward as they braced themselves against the sudden halt. "Just another day in public transportation," Agnes chuckled lightly, easing some of Lila's tension. As they resumed their conversation, Lila noticed Victor, the businessman who had ignored her earlier, standing at the front of the bus with an expression of frustration on his face. He had been unable to find a seat and now appeared agitated as he scanned the crowded interior. "Some people just don't know how to treat others," Agnes commented softly when she noticed Victor's demeanor. Lila nodded in agreement but felt a pang of empathy for him despite his earlier rudeness. "Maybe he's having a rough day," she said thoughtfully. Agnes raised an eyebrow but didn't press further on Victor's character. Instead, she turned back to Lila and continued sharing stories from her life, tales filled with laughter and lessons learned over decades. As they reached their destination, a bustling downtown area, the bus doors opened with a hiss, allowing fresh air to rush in and mix with the warm atmosphere inside. Passengers began shuffling toward the exit, eager to escape into the streets. "Thank you for your kindness today," Lila said sincerely as she stood up from her seat. Agnes smiled warmly back at her. "It was my pleasure. Remember that kindness is always worth giving." With that sentiment lingering in her mind, Lila stepped off the bus into the vibrant city street filled with people rushing past one another, each carrying their own burdens and joys. As she walked toward her community center, Lila reflected on how quickly life could shift from moments of cruelty to moments of kindness. The encounter with Agnes reminded her that there were still good people in this world willing to lend a hand or offer support when it was needed most. Meanwhile, Victor remained on the bus for just a moment longer after everyone else had exited. He felt an unfamiliar sense of discomfort wash over him as he replayed his earlier encounter with Lila in his mind, a nagging feeling that perhaps he had acted too hastily in dismissing her request for help. The bus driver called out from his seat at the front, "Last stop. Everyone off." Victor sighed heavily and stepped off the bus into the cool afternoon air. He adjusted his tie nervously as he looked around at his surroundings. This part of town was unfamiliar territory for him. As he walked down the street toward his office building, a looming structure that seemed even more imposing than usual, he couldn't shake off that feeling of regret lingering within him like an unwelcome shadow. Just then, he spotted Lila again across the street through bustling pedestrians, her bright smile illuminating even the grayest corners of this urban landscape as she waved goodbye to Agnes, who had also disembarked from another bus nearby. For reasons he couldn't quite understand yet, Victor felt compelled to approach them both, to apologize or perhaps seek some form of redemption for his earlier behavior, but uncertainty held him back like chains weighing heavily on his conscience. Instead, he stood frozen for just a moment longer before turning away from them both, an opportunity lost amidst his swirling thoughts and insecurities about who he truly wanted to be versus who he had become over time. The unexpected encounter. As Shayla navigated through the crowded bus, she felt the weight of her pregnancy pressing down on her. Each step was a reminder of the life growing within her, a constant source of joy and anxiety. She scanned the rows of seats, hoping for a moment of respite, but each one was filled with weary commuters lost in their own worlds. Just as she approached the middle of the bus, she spotted a seat near the window that seemed to be available. A flicker of hope ignited within her. However, as she reached for it, a young man in a hoodie suddenly shifted his backpack from the adjacent seat onto his lap, claiming the space for himself. Shayla's heart sank as she forced a polite smile and moved on, feeling invisible amidst the throng. Meanwhile, Victor, who had been standing at the front of the bus, noticed Shayla's struggle from a distance. He had been lost in his own thoughts, grappling with feelings of inadequacy and frustration after his unexpected day off from work. The sight of Shayla reminded him of his own mother who had raised him alone, struggling to make ends meet while working multiple jobs. Yet, he found himself unable to muster any sympathy for her plight. Instead, he felt an overwhelming urge to distance himself from any reminders of vulnerability. As Shayla continued down the aisle, she finally reached the back of the bus where an elderly man was seated. He looked up from his newspaper and offered her a warm smile. "You can sit here if you'd like," he said kindly. "Thank you," Shayla replied gratefully as she settled into the seat beside him. The man introduced himself as George and they exchanged pleasantries. George's presence was comforting, he had an aura of wisdom that made Shayla feel at ease. As they chatted about their day, Shayla shared snippets about her work at the Children's Center and how much she loved being around kids. George listened intently, nodding along with understanding. "Children have a way of bringing joy into our lives," he remarked. "They remind us of what truly matters." Shayla smiled at his words, feeling a sense of connection with this stranger who seemed genuinely interested in her story. Just then, the bus hit a bump in the road, causing it to jolt slightly. Shayla instinctively placed her hand on her belly to steady herself. Across the aisle, Victor was still preoccupied with his thoughts when he overheard their conversation. He couldn't help but glance over at them, feeling an odd mixture of irritation and intrigue. Here was this young woman, pregnant and seemingly cheerful, while he felt like his whole world was crumbling around him. The bus continued on its route, weaving through traffic as more passengers boarded and disembarked at various stops. The atmosphere inside remained tense due to Jared's earlier outburst. People were cautious about engaging in conversation or making eye contact with one another. As they approached another stop, a commotion erupted near the front of the bus when Jared, the man who had been so impatient earlier, began arguing with another passenger over a seat dispute. His voice rose above the din as he berated a young woman for taking his spot. "Are you serious?" she exclaimed defensively. "There are plenty of seats available." Shayla watched in disbelief as Jared's anger boiled over into full-blown confrontation. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glanced away while others exchanged worried looks. "Why don't you just calm down?" Victor finally interjected, surprising even himself with his outburst. He had been silently observing Jared's behavior for long enough. Jared turned to Victor with narrowed eyes. "And who do you think you are? Mind your own business." His voice dripped with contempt. Victor felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. It was as if he could no longer sit back and watch this display unfold without saying something. "You're making everyone uncomfortable," he shot back defiantly. The tension in the bus escalated as other passengers began to murmur among themselves, some in support of Victor while others seemed hesitant to take sides. Shayla felt her heart race. She had never witnessed such hostility in such close quarters before. She glanced at George beside her. He looked equally concerned but maintained his composure. "Let's all just take a breath," George said calmly, attempting to defuse the situation. "We're all just trying to get home after a long day." But Jared wasn't having it. He continued to glare at Victor while gesturing wildly with his hands as if trying to assert dominance over the space around him. "Enough," shouted another passenger, a woman in her 30s who had finally reached her breaking point. "This is ridiculous. We're all tired and just want to get home." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog as silence enveloped the bus momentarily. It was clear that everyone was fed up with Jared's antics. Feeling emboldened by this unexpected show of solidarity among strangers, Shayla decided to speak up too. "We're all dealing with our own struggles," she said gently but firmly. "There's no need for hostility." Jared's expression shifted slightly at her words. For a brief moment, he seemed taken aback by this unexpected challenge to his authority. Victor seized upon this opportunity to further confront Jared's behavior. "You don't know what anyone else is going through," he added pointedly. "Maybe if you took a moment to look around instead of focusing on yourself, you'd see that." The atmosphere inside the bus crackled with tension as passengers held their breath waiting for Jared's response. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jared scoffed dismissively and turned away from them both, his bravado faltering under the weight of collective disapproval surrounding him. Shayla felt a wave of relief wash over her as she exchanged glances with Victor and George. Their unity against hostility had created an unexpected bond among them all. As they continued their journey through city streets filled with honking horns and bustling pedestrians outside their windows, Lila reflected on how interconnected their lives were, even if they didn't realize it yet. Little did they know that this moment would serve as a catalyst for change, not just within themselves but also within Jared, who would soon find himself facing consequences far beyond what anyone could foresee. The revelation. As Shayla slowly made her way down the aisle of the bus, she felt a mix of hope and disappointment with each seat she passed. The warmth of the crowded space enveloped her, but it was not the comfort she sought. Instead, it felt stifling, as if the air had been sucked out of the bus, leaving only tension and impatience in its wake. She cradled her belly with one hand, a protective gesture that had become second nature to her. Finally, she reached the back of the bus where an empty seat awaited her. Relief washed over her as she settled into it, grateful for the momentary reprieve from standing. She glanced around at her fellow passengers, some engrossed in their phones, others lost in thought, and felt a sense of camaraderie with these strangers who shared this fleeting moment in time. Across the aisle, Victor sat with his arms crossed, his expression still clouded by frustration. He had been trying to shake off the lingering guilt from earlier but found it difficult to do so amidst the chaos of the bus. As he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, he caught sight of Shayla and felt an unexpected pang of recognition. There was something about her demeanor that resonated with him, a quiet strength that reminded him of his own struggles. Just then, the bus hit a bump in the road, causing Shayla to grip her belly instinctively. The movement startled Victor, who turned to look at her more closely. He noticed how she seemed to be talking softly to herself, perhaps reassuring her unborn child. It stirred something within him, a flicker of empathy that he had been trying to suppress. "Are you okay?" Victor asked unexpectedly, his voice cutting through the noise of the bus. Shayla looked up, surprised by his sudden concern. "I'm fine," she replied with a faint smile. "Just a little tired." Victor nodded, feeling an odd sense of connection as they exchanged glances. "I get it," he said quietly. "Long days can take their toll." The brief exchange lingered in Shayla's mind as they continued their journey through the city streets. She could sense that there was more to Victor than met the eye, a depth hidden beneath his exterior that spoke of struggles and disappointments. Meanwhile, Jared sat near the front of the bus, still simmering with anger over his earlier encounter at the bus stop. The confrontation had left him feeling exposed and vulnerable, emotions he was not accustomed to experiencing. He glanced around at his fellow passengers and noticed how they seemed to avoid making eye contact with him. It only fueled his irritation further. As he fumed silently, memories from earlier in the day flooded back, his argument with his ex-wife over alimony payments and how it felt like he was losing control over every aspect of his life. Each recollection stoked the fire within him, making it harder for him to let go of his anger. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted near the back of the bus as two teenagers began arguing over something trivial, a backpack that had accidentally been knocked onto the floor during a sudden stop. The noise drew everyone's attention, including Jared's. "Can you two just shut up?" Jared snapped without thinking, his voice booming above the din. The teenagers fell silent for a moment before one of them shot back defiantly, "Maybe if you weren't such a jerk, we wouldn't be arguing." The tension in the bus escalated as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Victor felt a surge of frustration at Jared's outburst. He could see how it affected those around them, especially Shayla, who sat quietly in her seat with an expression that mirrored concern. "Hey," Victor said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We're all just trying to get home here. Let's keep it civil." Jared turned to face Victor with narrowed eyes. "And who do you think you are? The bus police?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. Victor stood up slightly in his seat, unwilling to back down. "No one wants to hear you yelling at kids over nothing," he shot back. Shayla watched as tension mounted between them. She could feel her heart racing at the prospect of confrontation escalating further. Just then, Agnes, the elderly woman who had shared kindness with Shayla earlier, shifted in her seat and spoke up. "Gentlemen," Agnes said firmly but kindly. "Let's remember we're all human beings here. We all have our struggles." Her words hung in the air like a bomb over an open wound, momentarily diffusing some of the hostility present on the bus. "Exactly," Shayla added softly from her seat. "We're all just trying to get through our day." Victor glanced at Shayla and saw something in her eyes, a plea for understanding that resonated deeply within him. He realized that perhaps they were all fighting their own battles beneath their surfaces. Even Jared was not immune to hardship despite his abrasive demeanor. Jared remained silent for a moment as if weighing their words against his own feelings of resentment before finally huffing out an exasperated breath and turning away from them both. As they continued on their journey through city streets filled with honking horns and bustling pedestrians outside their windows, Lila reflected on how interconnected their lives were, even if they didn't realize it yet. The atmosphere inside the bus shifted slightly, conversations resumed tentatively as passengers exchanged glances filled with newfound camaraderie born from shared experiences, each person carrying their own burdens while navigating this urban landscape together. But just then, an unexpected event would unfold. A sudden jolt from behind sent shockwaves through everyone on board as they braced themselves against their seats. The path to forgiveness. The bus rattled along its route, each bump in the road a reminder of the tension that had filled the air just moments before. Shayla sat quietly, her thoughts swirling like the leaves caught in the wind outside. She felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at Jared for his earlier rudeness, empathy for the struggles of those around her, and an overwhelming desire to protect the life growing within her. As the bus continued its journey, Shayla couldn't help but glance around at her fellow passengers. The young mother with the fussing toddler was still trying to soothe her child, her voice a soft murmur amidst the noise. A few seats down, Victor sat with his arms crossed, staring out the window as if he could will away his frustrations. And then there was Jared, who had settled into a seat near the front, his expression dark and brooding. The atmosphere inside the bus was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. Shayla felt a sudden urge to bridge that gap, to reach out and connect with those around her in a way that could diffuse the negativity lingering in the air. "Excuse me," she said softly, turning to Victor. "I know it's been a long day for everyone, but maybe we could all take a moment to breathe and remember that we're all in this together?" Victor turned to her, surprised by her words. "You're right," he admitted reluctantly. "It's easy to forget that sometimes." Shayla smiled gently at him, grateful for his willingness to engage. "We all have our battles," she continued. "But kindness can go a long way." Just then, Jared overheard their conversation and scoffed loudly. "Kindness? What good does that do when people are so self-absorbed?" His tone was harsh, cutting through the tentative camaraderie that had begun to form. Shayla felt her heart race. She had hoped for understanding but was met with hostility instead. "It doesn't hurt to try," she replied firmly, meeting Jared's gaze head-on. "We all have our struggles, yours may be different from mine, but they're still valid." Jared's expression shifted slightly as he processed her words. For a moment, he seemed taken aback by her directness. But then his defenses went up again, and he retorted, "What do you know about my struggles? You don't know anything about me." "I may not know your story," Shayla responded calmly, "but I do know what it feels like to be dismissed or ignored. We're all just trying to get through our days." Victor watched this exchange unfold with growing interest. He had been caught off guard by Shayla's courage and empathy. He found himself wanting to support her stance against Jared's bitterness. "Look," Victor interjected, "we've all had tough days, some worse than others. But lashing out at each other won't help anyone." Jared shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly torn between his anger and the unexpected solidarity forming among these strangers. The bus continued its journey through the city streets as silence enveloped them for a moment, a collective pause where everyone seemed lost in their thoughts. As they approached another stop, Shayla noticed a young girl standing on the curb waiting to board. The girl looked nervous as she clutched a worn backpack tightly against her chest, a reminder of how vulnerable we all can feel at times. "Hey!" Shayla called out gently as the bus came to a halt. "You can come on. There's room." The girl hesitated but then stepped forward cautiously as the doors opened wide. As she boarded and took a seat near Shayla, she offered a shy smile that lit up her face. "Thank you," the girl said softly. Shayla returned the smile warmly. "No problem. We're all in this together." Jared watched this interaction unfold with growing discomfort, something about Shayla's kindness stirred something deep within him, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he had lost sight of what truly mattered in life. As they continued down their route, Victor turned to Jared again, sensing an opportunity for connection amidst their differences. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been where you are, feeling like everything is out of control and wanting to lash out at anyone who crosses my path." Jared looked at Victor skeptically but remained silent. "I lost my job unexpectedly last year," Victor continued, revealing more than he intended. "It felt like my whole world crumbled overnight, the pressure of bills piling up and feeling like I had failed my family." Shayla listened intently as Victor shared his story. She could see how it resonated with Jared too, each man grappling with their own demons while struggling to find their footing in an unpredictable world. "I learned that it was okay to ask for help," Victor added quietly. "That vulnerability doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." Jared shifted again in his seat. Perhaps there was wisdom in those words after all. Just then, another passenger, a middle-aged woman sitting nearby, chimed in. "I've been through my share of struggles too," she said softly but firmly. "Divorce is never easy, it shakes your foundation and makes you question everything." Shayla felt a sense of unity forming among them, a shared understanding that transcended their differences. "Maybe we could all use this moment as an opportunity for growth," Shayla suggested gently. "To forgive ourselves for our past mistakes and extend kindness to one another instead of anger." Jared sat silently as he absorbed their words. Deep down inside him lay an aching desire for connection, a longing for understanding that had been buried beneath layers of resentment for far too long. As they neared their final destination, the bus station bustling with activity, Shayla turned toward Jared one last time before they disembarked. "I hope you find peace," she said sincerely. "We all deserve it." Jared met her gaze and felt something shift within him, a flicker of realization that perhaps he didn't have to carry his burdens alone anymore. As they stepped off the bus into the bright afternoon sun, each passenger carried with them not just their individual stories but also newfound hope, a reminder that even amidst chaos and conflict lies an opportunity for compassion and healing.